Dixie here. Today I want to address my experience with the DupleXL and discuss its limitations out on the Laugavegur trail in Iceland. The worst windy conditions I've ever experienced camping was on the Laugavegur trail near the second hut, which is close to the highest point on the trail. So it kind of makes sense because you're at the highest elevation, it's very exposed, and the wind is just whipping around up there. Now, to be fair, the wind that I experienced that night is not like an everyday type thing. That was extreme for even Iceland in that area, but that is one of the windiest parts of the trail just because you are so high up and so exposed, and I guess it's positioning in the mountains. It didn't start off too bad. It was kind of windy throughout the day, but while I was setting up my tent, it wasn't whipping like crazy. Then after the wind started whipping pretty hard, the rain came in and it ended up being a complete mess. Oh man. To add insult to injury, the wind was snatching up my stakes out of the ground, so my tent was collapsing in the middle of all of the wind and the rain. This was my first night on the trail, and I really thought that I might have to ditch out to the privy, and if I hadn't noticed how horribly it smelled earlier in the evening, I might have done just that. There are rock break rings set up in the camping area near that hut to help with blocking some of the wind. It was so extreme that night, I'm not sure that it really helped that much, and if it did, then I would have hated to see what it was like without that rock ring windbreak. On the video of my hike of the Laugavegur trail, which I'll link to in the video description, if you haven't seen it, you can watch it there, but a lot of people commented that maybe the Zpacks DupleXL was not the best choice for this particular hike. So let's kind of dive into that. First of all, the Zpacks DupleXL is made from Dyneema, which is the strongest fabric in the world. This tent has a lot of tensile strength, so I wasn't necessarily worried about it ripping, tearing, shredding. I mean, I was a little bit, but I felt more comfortable being in a Dyneema tent than a nylon tent in that sense anyway. In fact, I had no damage to my tent whatsoever, but there were some nylon tents at another campsite that actually got torn up in the wind that night, and they weren't even at the location with the craziest wind. I didn't get to find out particulars from people who camped in that spot near me that night because, as usual, I was the last one to leave camp. But I do know, like I said, that in another spot there were some nylon tents that were damaged. But I definitely do think that the DupleXL had some shortcomings on this hike. For one, the gaps below the vestibule doors are really big, and there are things that you can do to kind of fine-tune and set the Zpacks DupleXL up like to where it hugs the ground more, but in general, in your general setup of this tent, those gaps are pretty large compared to some other tents. So that's something that I think wasn't helpful in this particular instance on this trek because the wind was able to rush in so much there, and also the mist from the rain and everything, it just didn't have as much protection from the elements that maybe another tent would have. Also in the past, I've tried to avoid using anything with a zipper because I don't trust them to hold up over a long period of time. But in this situation, I definitely think a zipper door would have made a huge difference with the wind that night. And on a side note, I'm hoping that the X-Mid Pro that I have on order would kind of help mitigate this issue if I had had it in Iceland instead of the Zpacks DupleXL, but I'll let y'all know when I get to test it out. The DupleXL is a single-walled tent, so I think that that was something else I had working against me using this particular tent in this application, because with a double-walled tent you would have some mesh netting on the inside, or some of them have another solid wall, and then you'd have the solid wall on the outside. So in the vibration of the wind pushing the tent around, you would have that mesh to kind of help block some of that mistiness that was bumping around. But with the Zpacks DupleXL, it just went right into the air and onto my sleeping bag and onto me. So when the tent was knocking all around, it was essentially raining on the inside of my tent, and all of my stuff started getting kind of soaked. Luckily, the rain had stopped by morning, and with the extreme wind blowing all around, by the time I woke up, everything was completely dry, so it worked out. But I do think with a double wall tent, having a mesh inner would have helped block some of that mist. And also, in general, a double wall tent is a little bit warmer, more insulating, because you have another layer to kind of help block some of the heat in. And with the temperatures that I was experiencing that night, I was probably in the mid 30s at the lowest, maybe the lower 30s. Having added warmth to help mitigate the chances of hypothermia, especially since there was so much moisture, you know, that would be a good thing for sure. Also, it's really loud. I mean, when it's that windy, I think you're probably not going to sleep well anyway, but certainly the sound of the trash bag whipping in the wind noise of the Dyneema isn't conducive of a peaceful night's rest. I think the biggest issue I had that night was not necessarily the performance of the DupleXL itself, but the tent stakes. I could have gone with beefier tent stakes. I don't mind having to stack rocks on top of my tent stakes if they're snatching up. So if that's something you don't want to fool with and you just want to go with something that's beefier, then you have that option. But to be honest, with how crazy the wind was that night, I think any reasonable backpacking tent stake would have probably snatched up out of the ground. Now, if you go with something that's just like crazy, bulletproof, huge, whatever, then, you know, maybe that is something you want to do if you go to Iceland and you think you might experience high winds. But I think regardless, anything that I would have carried that night, I would have had to get out and stack rocks on top of my stakes. So I was grateful for the rocks that were around. I probably could have done a better job when I was setting up my tent, making sure that I secured stuff the best that I could, but I just didn't know that it was going to get that windy that night. Like I said, when I set it up, it wasn't too bad. It definitely was annoying having to get out in the rain in my pajamas when I'm not wanting to get hypothermia to fix something that I could have done better to start with. But I finally got it after like the second or third time getting out and stacking different rocks. Where there's a will, there's a way. So yes, I do feel like the DupleXL did have some limitations in Iceland, and while it is my favorite tent of all the backpacking tents I've tried, that doesn't mean that it's going to be the perfect fit for every scenario, every terrain. I think above tree line, it's not always the ideal tent for this type of situation. Also in hailstorms, I think nylon is going to perform better than Dyneema because it's got more give to it. Now, with all of that said, if I was to go back in time to when I was packing for my trip to Iceland, would I still put the DupleXL in my pack to take with me? And the answer is yes. But that is personal preference because, one, I have a lot of experience with a Dyneema tent and also a tent that sets up using trekking poles. If you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience with that and you've not been in a stormy situation where you've had to stack rocks on stakes, then maybe you would be a little bit more timid of this going into a situation that could be much more dangerous than something like in Alabama in the summertime. I would understand why somebody might want a more sturdy tent that they know is gonna stand up and not blow away. I carry so much weight in tripods, camera equipment, etc., that for me to have this tent and make do with it and shave off some weight, it's definitely worth it. But again, that's a personal preference, and if you're not toting a bunch of camera weight or a bunch of luxury items, then having that extra weight of a sturdier tent might be worth it to you. Now, there are two other ultralight trekking pole tents, and I think based on the design, they'd be better options than the DupleXL for the Laugavegur trail. Neither was available to me when I went to Iceland, and I don't think you'll be able to order either anytime soon. But one that I mentioned before is the Durston X-Mid 2 Pro, which I did manage to order when they became available a couple of weeks ago. And the other is the new Tarp Tent Dipole 2 Lithium. It's a little heavier and I don't know that I'll ever use it, but it does seem like it would hold up better in the wind than the DupleXL. So if you're not experienced with a tent like the DupleXL, or you're looking for a particular tent that would be best suited for this type of experience, then I'd look into a 4-season tent. That way you know you've got the most warmth and protection from the elements. You can have issues with tents where the tent poles can snap from the wind and the force of being blown over. A lot of those tents come with a little splint that you could put on a tent pole if it were to snap because accidents happen even when you're packing them up and stuff like that. If it doesn't come with that, then that's something I would definitely look into getting if you're going to an area where you know there's going to be a ton of wind. If you're considering hiking the Laugavegur trail, you could just avoid camping in this spot if you're going to be in a tent, so you're not out there in the rock rings in Wind City. There is the option of getting a reservation for the hut, so you have a bunk if you just want to stay at that spot. Or you could camp at Laugavegur the first night. When you get there, just stay at that first hut and make a long day of your first day of actually hiking and skip the second hut and go camp at the third one. Regardless of what you decide, I would say having flexibility in your schedule is definitely important. Whatever mileage you think you can do and want to do, I would try to reduce that daily average, just so if you decide, hey, the weather's kind of bad and I want to hunker down at Laugavegur or one of the other huts because I don't want to have to walk in the weather today, or I don't want to have to camp at a particular hut that I think might have bad weather at night. Just knowing that when you go to Iceland, inclement weather is very normal, and having the ability to work around that, I think, would make you safer and your trip more enjoyable. All right, y'all, well, that is all I have for you today. I hope you found this information useful, especially if you're looking to go to Iceland. My next video coming up is going to be about my itinerary, all of the details that went into planning my trip, and some useful tips if you are also planning a trip to Iceland, specifically to do the Laugavegur trail or the extension on into Skógar. If y'all have any other questions about the performance of the DupleXL in Iceland, or if you've got recommendations for tents that you used while you were there, feel free to leave all of that stuff in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe before you go, and we will see y'all next time.